I don't know what I want to title this recording. I primarily want to talk about features of fascism and the right, which includes very much the whole SJW movement, which I regard as proto-fascist. I understand that might be disorientating for some people to hear, although I imagine that most SJWs are in such tight echo chambers that they don't go looking for intellectual challenge. I mean, there's not that much intellectual challenge out there. There are very few voices that, even the voices that detract from them, they don't sort of speak at a kind of in a kind of direct philosophical critique that sort of hits the nail on the head. There are some people that kind of venture quite close to it, but they don't directly attack it. They just sort of describe it, and they don't profess, at least, to be addressing the heart of the beast, which is that's something that I want to do. And part of this recording we'll try to deal with that directly. But the kind of the proto-fascist or SJW movement is so successful in part because it's kind of like a problem within a problem, and so it's kind of it's a confused form of fascism, and so they kind of they rely on the fascist conception of society, and they philosophically are kind of fascistic in their conceptual matrix of reality, in terms of seeing people as sort of differing breeds and groups based on their kind of ethnic identity, and perhaps subdivide that identity concept in a more fractional way. But politically, the same kind of resolution which they seek or address, redress which they demand, is a photocopy. It's an exact replica of the fascistic political and cultural call for reform. Now, it is proto-fascism because it doesn't clearly. You see, it's very strange, because basically what SJWs are is they are fascistic at heart, but they rationally haven't taken all their philosophical stances to their logical conclusions, and in so doing, they can kind of you see, already that gives them the kind of the breathing space to kind of think of themselves as being more than just representatives of their identity faction, but representatives of a kind of greater justice which can offer a kind of optimum justice to all differing identity groups, and how I there's a summary of depicting this, which is and I kind of do this in a mocking way, but this is a good kind of simplistic summary, is that they believe that there can be a rainbow Hitler that can mediate the differing claims between the different victim groups, and that people are all victims in their own way or whatever, and there'll be some way to mediate them, and there'll be some kind of perfect socialistic matrix that kind of can find some way to have all the groups having some kind of a quality of outcome redistribution mechanism within culture, and that everyone can plug into the same filtering device and therefore treat people the right amount of compensatory adjustment to their particular historical how that person is a representative of some historical injustice, and therefore be have the scales balanced, So they believe that there's some way to do this. Now, the fascists are at least practical enough to know that if you want justice for an identity faction, that society, it's not possible for society to serve more than one master. Politically, so in a sense, the SJW is a kind of political idiot, because their vision of this kind of rainbow Hitler, that you can have a kind of authoritarian justice dispensed upon society, because you're going to have this kind of strong political force that takes history and the task of correcting history into his or her own hands, in kind of dispensing the redistributive payback and sort of retribution, and this is their concept of social justice. So even the term social justice warrior, I mean, it is a kind of a calling card of the fascistic solution, as it were. But because politically they can't actually get behind the actual solution, and in as much as they ever try to translate their view into any kind of political action, it always just precipitates a fascistic, you end up moving more and more towards fascism in some sense, because all these measures only operate within the fascistic kind of universe. They only make sense in the fascistic philosophy and culture. And so when you start, when for instance, in the current political situation, you could say an atmosphere, when people have to pander to this kind of policy, when policymakers have to kind of engage with these kind of emotionally charged calls for policy that issues that form of social justice, you end up destabilizing democratic, secular values, liberal values, all because that policy only works within the fascistic conception of justice and the fascistic worldview. And so the more you kind of indulge it, the more it makes a mess of everything, and then that mess is blamed on the fact that you haven't gone far enough, that you haven't doubled down and done it harshly enough, and done it with the right, kind of retributivistic revenge framework, because you haven't completed the revenge, you haven't completed the justice, and so you're always just blamed for not being a stronger authoritarian, and so just it destabilizes all the liberal values enough to actually eventually create its own kind of rhetoric to go full on fascist. Now, practically, even the fascists have to get rid of the SJWs, because they will eventually see that it's not going to bring justice to all the identities, it's only going to bring justice to one identity, and that isn't the fulfillment of the full vision. It's that fascism must be in service to all the identities. At some point there must be an equilibrium, and when that equilibrium is kind of threatened by the fascistic solution, and it looks like there can only be one master of the house, then you can kind of see that the wolves and the sheep, as it were, but the SJWs therefore get revealed as being the real useful idiots of the fascists. And so, but their worldview really is proto-fascism. They promote measures, they promote policy that is fascistic. So they don't identify as being fascists, because they think that their solution will kind of, it's kind of, you have to indulge in what they're, in the kind of things that they want until things look more balanced. Now the problem is that how they achieve their balance, like all fascists, is by deduction. They want to remove things from the other side of the equation. They don't want to add, they don't want to build anything. In fact, they're very incapable of building anything. I mean, the economic history of most fascistic regimes is basically theft and kind of bulk redistribution, and then, it kind of, without the war economy, I doubt these societies would have done so well, especially without the kind of the cultural control that scenario sort of lends to the leader. Because in some sense, I'm not going to get into critique against fascism, although that is in a sense what I want to focus on, is I just want to focus on critiquing identity politics, which the purest form you could say is just kind of blatant fascism, and then the scary form, I guess, is the kind of proto-fascism, because it kind of shields itself from a critique on that level. And so this is the problem, is that you can't actually address the racism that actually drives the social justice movement, is just as racist as any other fascist group. They just consider they consider themselves virtuous for indulging in the racism in the way that they do, because a double standard, getting behind a double standard and being practical enough to acknowledging the need for the double standard as also the vehicle of liberation, and obviously employing those sorts of double standards on society, which, it has an incredibly regressive effect on it's really anti-transformation. It's kind of, because it only manages to do anything on the level of a kind of artificial transformation, which it actually makes it harder to increase standards. It makes it much harder, because you create basically instead of building a ladder, you're sort of going to offer a kind of a rope that people can climb up that rope, but very few people can climb up that rope. And then the people that are on that rope, because it isn't a proper ladder, it gets broader and broader as people are used to kind of using the authentic ladder, because the rope is incredibly limited and it's basically built on some kind of redistributive theft. The people who are on the rope can only kind of justify their own guilt by saying, no, we're going to expand the rope program. But, the rope is built out of the kind of lifeblood of the system itself. And so it kind of, you can only do that at the cost of diminishing, where the rope gets you to or whatever. And then, you usually end up with an incredibly class delineate, like you end up with a kind of occult elitism, so it's weird. You get this kind of fake upper class, which is built on corruption, and it's sort of, the whole system becomes so dependent on this corruption to legitimizing itself. It gets very ugly very fast. I've mixed up some topics slightly that probably could have been elaborated a bit better, but there are so many ways to take this beast apart that it's – But basically it gets into this kind of decadence, which is in fact corruption, and it basically is trying to privilege that corruption as being beyond criticism, especially beyond self-criticism, because that form of decadence belongs to the collective, it belongs to the group, and then it's as soon as that's given kind of political force in any way, it has to, I mean, it basically ends the whole the idea of open politics becomes impossible because it won't allow criticism of it. It operates on a kind of orthodoxy, and you can already get a foretaste of this in the mentality of SJWs, in their orthodoxy. They don't intellectually defend themselves on any level. What they defend is the orthodoxy of their position, the kind of the righteousness that they assume. And if you dare to mock and challenge that righteousness, this is why they kind of this is why art itself becomes under siege in this fascistic atmosphere, is because if you're a comedian or do art in some sort of way that is not flattering to the vision of the movement, to the vision of progress in terms of how this justice is conceived of and how society must be made pliable to this particular historical redress, because it's all about fixing history, and therefore the present just becomes this the present condition and the present time is just there and waiting to be salvaged by some strong authoritarian to take the reins and to objectify it until, to his mind or her mind, history is vindicated in terms of the owed indignities of one group must be comparable to the indignities suffered by other groups. See, it's not about promoting dignity, it's about proving dignity through the test of an equal outcome. And this is why they will always use the propaganda of shame as the implicit argument for violence. So whenever they are trying to say, for shame, this identity has not suffered as much as the other identity, that is the implicit justification that redress and suffering is the means to the end of a more just solution and reconciliation. So it's like they have chosen that as the path, and you don't even have the right to criticize that. That is their worldview essentially, and the most important part of this setup, and it's almost it's a strange emotional argument that you don't get a seat at the table until you've had an equal infringement against your group identity consciousness and your group identity standing. But okay, let me make that point in a more pertinent and relevant way. It's that it's very strange that the kind of the emotional logic in the kind of the means justify the ends covers up the practical issue about, is this the fastest way to develop? Is this the fastest way to fix the actual problem? Because it is a different definition of problem. The problem is not how to put people into a better position. It's how to quantify some kind of group pride, and how to make sure that some kind of damage in terms of that group pride has reached some kind of parity. It's an equivalence of damage. And because it can only measure that negative aspect, and you don't get a voice until you've at least, so the only person with a valid voice in terms of working out the means to the end of fixing the problem is the person who has the most skin in this game, and the person with the most skin in this game is the person who has had the most damage. And so until you equalize that sense of damage, you don't get a voice. You don't get to say, no, that's not the best way to achieve the most upliftment, the most development, the most transformation. You don't get to even discuss what transformation means, because it's shielded by this very retributivistic based, collectivist based. If I don't get to damage you as much as I perceive that you've damaged me, you don't get to talk to me. I get to objectify you, and we can't even communicate. And in fact, that's part of what they believe. They believe that you cannot. There's an essential, irreconcilable veil and almost like a cultural bubble that cannot be interpenetrated. That in fact, groups in this sense are separate but equal. That's exactly what they believe in a kind of ethnic cultural. It's very strange. And you see, the fascists are at least honest enough to know that if this is going to be your mentality, you have to have separate. You have to be apart. In fact, you have to employ some form of apartheid if this is going to be your mentality. But if this is not your mentality, then you can actually have a real democracy. Then you can actually have real policy debate, and you can discuss things practically. But this framing of identity means that essentially it's meaningless to have a state with more than one identity. You can't do that unless those separate but equal identities are see, it's strange that what I've just ended off on is asking that question, which I didn't answer, and phrasing it like that. That it doesn't actually have an answer, but you see, you can logically kind of get to that point where you think that you can get to the point of asking the question and thinking that there should be an answer, but there actually isn't an answer. Okay, I'm going to make a meta point now, but what I have literally just illustrated is the cognitive dissonance, which is the kind of the bedrock of the proto-fascist mentality. This is what allows them to be proto-fascist, is that they think that this is the kind of the trial by fire that you have to go through. This is the hard balancing of the acts, and then afterwards, when we actually are when there is equal damage, then those separate but equal entities will be able to communicate with each other because they all have the same brand of damage. But you see, it's a fallacy. I mean, it doesn't actually, because how would they ever know that it's the same brand of damage? And in fact, this is the question that kind of unhinges the whole paradigm of their thinking, because their whole thinking is based on historical relativism. I mean, they can only see their own group's damage, historically speaking. And, like, you don't know what it's like to be the great-great-great-great-great-grandson of something, like in the American thing, it's like, oh, well, we are the ancestors of actual slaves. I mean, like, anyone can trace their family tree to stuff. There is a lot of stuff in history, and this is completely triggering what I've just said. Like, that would literally make people, they would make feminists have heart attacks or whatever. This white male is having an opinion and is saying things in the same tone and the same kind of emotional tenor, which should be only reserved for those who have a seat at deciding the future and how to get there. But you see, this is the point: is that it's built on a relativistic interface with history, and it's really quite autistic, or at least solipsistic, that you can only see it from your side, and you can't, and that there's some way to actually translate and compare these things. But I mean, there are travesties throughout history. In fact, a lot of people are somewhat the indirect effects of a lot of travesties. That there are some people who are the products of an oppressor class or an oppressor group or an oppressor identity, and let's say a victim identity. There are some people who are the progeny, who are the ancestors of the mixing of those two groups. What do you say to such people who are I mean, in the proto-fascist sense, they are what? Somewhat, they're exactly in the middle. They're exactly in the middle, and they have to somehow live with themselves. How do they do that? They are literally in the middle of the present, in some sense. And my point is that in some sense, that is how we should see ourselves. We should all see ourselves like that. And in fact, when we don't, it's impossible to actually take the reins of the present properly. If you take the reins of the present and you're only looking at the past, and you're only looking at trying to put something in the past in some kind of equilibrium, you don't, first of all, that by definition, from what I've just said, that makes you completely blind to being able to treat the present with any kind of real social justice, which is exactly what this ideology denies. It denies people social justice in the most visceral way possible by treating them as members of some kind of group experience. And that these shared experiences are kind of these animals, or these, they are sort of a single entity which are branded, and that brand is shared upon people who kind of amalgamate into this one animalistic being. And then that animalistic being has to be fed its pound of flesh. It has to be bartered with in terms of revenge. That's what it reduces life to. And it does this by mythologizing history and by making people completely blind to the facts on the ground at the present. And it says, no, we're not even allowed to look at the facts on the ground, because that is what the people with power do. That is what the people who have the pound of flesh that they're not feeding to us as our animalistic amalgamated hunger requires for our version of social justice. This is the fascist conception of reality. Now, there is a kind of cognitive dissonance, and I'm going to restate it, where the social justice warrior believes that this is a vehicle. This is a kind of a two-stage system, that you feed it the pound of flesh and then we all become humanity or something like that. I mean, there's a lot of cognitive, because I mean, like, in a sense they know that that's not true, because I mean, even the whole rhetoric of how people feed into it and how people kind of channel it, you know, it is so disgustingly racist. It's, you know, like, they talk about their radical self-love and you know, the kind of, you know, they make poems about their skin tone, you know, and about it's really, you know, it gets on the side of the kind of Nazi occult stuff, you know, it's that kind of vibe, really. But lost the thread of what I was thinking of. I was restating the point. Restating the point of the cognitive dissonance. So they think it's going to be a two-stage solution where they equalize the revenge that is required, or they equalize through the revenge that is required. Yeah, okay, well, you see, but there means to that equalization, and then after the equalization, suddenly, you know, we're all this. But they have to open their eyes that their means to their end is this huge indulgence in identity. See, I am in fact a classical Marxist, which now I've just alienated everyone, I guess. But I mean, there is nothing Marxist about the social justice warrior movement. I mean, it's patently fascist as far as I can see, and you can I can just point out that class consciousness is not some propaganda for some proletarian vanguard, you know, not some kind of elite group of you know, Lenin Führers or whatever you want to call it. The dictatorship of the proletarian has to be understood in context. But the class consciousness is not merely propaganda for the dictatorship of the proletarian, which I would even say, with hindsight, now we know that we probably, if we do go Marxist at some point past capitalism, we probably won't have a dictatorship of the proletarian. We probably won't have a revolution like Marx described, just as he premised all of his predictions, that they probably aren't very good, because conditions and history, you know, cannot be fully imagined. And we know that I mean, he had no idea about communications technology, he had no idea about the service industry. You know, a lot of things have changed. But class consciousness is not the propaganda tool for the dictatorship of the proletarian. Class consciousness is there to be it's there to be a kind of philosophical notion that you actually are transcending capitalism as well. You know, class consciousness is part of. I mean, in some sense, it's like this is going to get too tangential, but it's like, I mean, the theory of evolution, for instance, does not necessarily describe what is doing evolution. It is an approximation which evolution kind of falls into. You know, like if you call something a random mutation, it doesn't mean that it was a random mutation, but it's a big enough catch-all that it can encapsulate whatever process is happening, and you can derive some predictable features, you can do some theory work with that, but that doesn't mean that the theory, I mean, this is what Darwin himself meant when he said it's just a theory, is that it might be a successful theory, but that doesn't make it, it's not the same thing as it being true. It can still be useful, but you have to understand philosophically the limits. But the thing about the dictatorship of the proletarian is that it also, the thing about class consciousness is that it's not just propaganda for the dictatorship of the proletarian. This is obvious. Class consciousness is partly the litmus test for knowing that you have actually made something new, that you've actually transcended capitalism, is that there aren't classes anymore. People who are invested into identity politics, sorry, I should have just, without all that elaboration, I should have just gotten to this very point, is that they're not interested in dissolving politics. They're not interested in dissolving identity. People who are into identity politics want to displace politics with identity. I slightly misspoke, but I realize that's a good innovation. So they want to make identity the way in which they do something new. It's going to kind of occlude everything. It's going to suck everything into it. So, class consciousness is there to abolish class. Identity consciousness is not there to abolish identity. In the proto-fascist sense, in the cognitive dissonance sense, it kind of gives this weird implicit promise that it's going to make identity. You see, this is the thing. This is exactly what the cognitive dissonance is that it doesn't really tell you what it's going to do with it. Like, it doesn't say that it's going to become meaningless or it's going to become just. I guess that's. But I mean, what the fuck does that even mean? It doesn't mean anything. So, like, that's the problem with identity politics, is that it's not there to make identity disappear. It's not there to dissolve identity. It's there to give justice to your identity. And if that is the kind of if that is the founding claim of identity politics, it is essentially doomed to forcing itself to have societies in which there are only one identity and that there are very limited dealings with other identities, because anything that it touches that isn't the same identity is liable to have environmental responsibility heaped onto it. It's liable to give up all of its responsibility and faculty of self-criticism, because it is just too easy to play that game, to have absolutely no responsibility and any sense of self-criticism, and to just heap that on. And because there'll always be elements within a group that is their personality style. That's how they like thinking of the world, and they will want things at the expense of the out group. And so it's so easy to just say, well, it's the out group who of the other group which has displaced our rights, and make emotional arguments. I mean, in a sense, they're kind of like psychic vampires, and in any population, you have to have a culture that can actually deal with them effectively and basically suppress them. That's the only way that you get anywhere, is you identify these forces and you culturally basically have to rebuke them as being, because they're very self-serving. I mean, effectively, they are engines of corruption. And, they're very sly and they're very good at externalizing blame, essentially, and justifying their corruption in that way.